Hello and welcome to Hospitality Talks. My name is Sam-Erik and my partner in crime here is Abid Butt. And a warm welcome again we are now for the first time live here on YouTube. So thank you very much for all the viewers and live viewers who are here joining us. And if you like this kind of topics we are talking about, please subscribe and then press the notification button or the bell and you'll be notified every time we are live. We're also live on LinkedIn Live, and for the LinkedIn viewers, a warm welcome. And please also, we have a great panel from around the world. So in order to make them feel warm and welcome and happier, just press that heart or thumbs up button, and they will be most appreciated. And please ask any questions you have. We will address your comments and questions during this live session. So, Abid, what do you think about this? We have a great panel, right?
Superb panel, and truly, I think we've connected a lot of different continents. Well, welcome back to Hospitality Talks, everybody, and thank you for joining our series discussing the industry challenges during a pandemic. I'm Abid Butt. Asia was the first continent to deal with this spread of COVID-19 and possibly the first one to stabilize life in post-pandemic era. Our panel today will help us better understand the challenges with a focus on Asia Pacific. The coronavirus pandemic is a humanitarian crisis, but the economic impact will most certainly be severe as well. Our hearts go out to everyone impacted around the world. Again, a huge shout out to first responders and essential workers that are taking care of all of us. Over the last few weeks, as we all know, virtually 80% of the world's airplanes have been grounded. Hotels nearly sitting empty or closed down completely. Restaurants closed or barely servicing takeout service, and fleets of rental cars staying parked. As we try to understand the depth of this crisis, it might be useful to break it down in different phases from crises where we are today to restart recovery and possibly the new norm, whatever that happens to be. And the panel will help us understand that. Each of these phases, of course, will require distinct strategies and tactics. So without any further ado, let me, to start us out with this discussion, let me bring on Markland. Markland is CEO for the Centara Hotels and Resorts. Markland, thank you for taking the time to join us. How's your day been?
Excellent, Abid. Nearing the end of the day, and thank you for the invite.
Superb. Well, since we are covering different continents, Markland is based in Bangkok. Sam is in Europe. I'm in North America. And of course, we have somebody from Australia. Just a quick update and a quick state of affairs, Markland, the hotels in different markets that you operate, just a short update as to what these markets look like, if you don't mind to start us off.
Sure, Abid. I'd say, we operate 43 hotels right now. Most of those hotels are in Thailand. The impacts of COVID-19 didn't move into Thailand so immediately. As we all know, it started in China towards the end of January. We operated more or less normally for January, February, even into March. It was only as March progressed that the travel restrictions became more intense, and at that point in time, we had to start planning on closing properties. But our first focus, as the hotels still enjoyed reasonably good occupancies. In February, we were in the 50s, 60s range, was to really communicate to our guests, communicate to our staff, to give as much information as we could, as transparent as we could, so that they had a real understanding of the situation and what we were doing we were doing about it in terms of heightened levels of hygiene and sanitation. But today, going back to your initial question, of the 43 hotels, one of the few that is still open is the one I'm sitting in. It's our flagship property in the center of Bangkok, Centara Grand Central World. We have a few managed properties in different locations within Thailand. Overseas, we're in Oman, so Oman is still open. In fact, I have a nice story to share on Oman. We're operating still in Qatar, but in the Maldives, for example, where we have 2 properties, there are no flights going in at all. Maldives is essentially closed for now.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that update, Markland. Now, certainly, Centara is an owner-operator, plus you manage properties on other owners' behalf. Just wanted to ask you if there's anything specific Centara has done for various stakeholders, and in that category, it'll be your associates, of course, that you briefly talked about, guests, and certainly the owning entities that own the assets.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, communication is key. Verbally through our management teams, in written form. Initially, it was communication about what is COVID-19, what are the symptoms, what should we be doing to be better prepared for it. In Asia, perhaps more than other parts of the world, of course, we had SARS in 2002, 2003. Since then, we've had a very, very comprehensive pandemic response policy in place. We've occasionally updated it over the years. So when this situation first started occurring, it was back into that policy and making sure that we had everything in place to be able to do what we were communicating that we were doing to our various stakeholders. As you mentioned, yes, we operate we own about half of our network in terms of rooms, and we manage on behalf of third parties. And in this situation and in every situation, we treat our managed properties the same way as we do our owned. So we have communicated with our owners in relation to what they needed to do while they were operating, in relation to preparations for closing, and ultimately we'll also be talking about the restart at some point down the road. So having those communications mostly direct, person to person, obviously similar to the way we're doing it now via video calls or other means, but communication has been key.
Superb. Markland, communications is always a challenge. Under the best of circumstances, communication is a challenge. Any particular success stories, any particular initiatives that you might have used to stay connected with your audience?
I think the key element has been the speed of communication, get the messages out before people are really asking the questions, and then regular updates, giving the updates, but before people are starting to wonder what's happening. Of course, everyone has their preferred application for receiving updates on the number of cases and where they're occurring, and is it accelerating, is it slowing down? But in the midst of all that, it starts becoming a little bit confusing. So I think our role vis-a-vis our key stakeholders is to get a very real picture out there of what's happening in the hotels, what's impacting on our people, on our guests for as long as we had them, and the experiences our owners are going through, similar to what we're going through as owner.
I have a question about the employees that are partly who are working or then partly who are being laid off. How are you communicating? How are the hotels communicating with employees who might be all stressed out and they're looking after their sort of emotional well-being while they're out of their job?
Well, thank you for that question, Sam. The first thing I would say is we have not laid off any staff.
Oh, terrific.
We have put our staff on leave without pay. In some instances, no work, no pay. There are opportunities for government subsidies, which we're facilitating with. But our objective is to keep all our staff. For sure, they're not going to be working generally as they would normally, but at least keep them with some means to support themselves. We will be supplementing whatever the government is paying, and actually, what we're doing while we're doing that is we've been communicating a lot of online learning plans. Some of them are in-house in terms of using some of our own talent, our head of F&B, our head of housekeeping, to do different programs for the staff. And then also outside programs. There's a whole host of programs, even from universities that are available at no cost, that can stimulate the mind and keep you attuned to the real world that we all hope to return to soon.
Yeah, and are you using any social media channels to communicate with the staff, or what are the channels you are using for what you mentioned?
Absolutely. I mean, you can't ignore social media for any kind of communication today. So definitely getting stories out on social media has been one of our thoughts. And actually next week we hope to launch a kind of a series of activities like cooking classes and different activities to really keep people energized and focused on other things than the somewhat sad happenings around them. So definitely social media, email. We use different applications for all of our video calls. We're actually meeting, not surprisingly, given that we're in a crisis, but we're actually meeting more regularly than we would normally. It's just we're not meeting in the same room. We're being responsible about that, but using tools like Microsoft Teams, Zoom, different tools for different audiences in order to make sure that everyone is kept updated.
Well, thank you. That's very encouraging to hear what you're doing. Over to you, Abid.
Well, Markland, you mentioned that the industry had dealt with SARS and MERS and H1N1. Unfortunately, our world continuously changes. It wasn't all that long ago that terrorism was never an issue for travel and tourism. That became a big part of how we operated our hotels. Any particular learnings, any particular takeaways from this episode that we can prepare our assets, our stakeholders moving forward?
I think I mean, SARS, as I mentioned earlier, was 2002, 2003, and now we're in 2020. We've been talking a little bit about social media. So information gets communicated much more quickly than it did in the past. Unfortunately, a lot of misinformation and even some fake news. So, that's why, as I mentioned earlier, we were so preoccupied on getting out the right messages, clear messages. So I think that's the most important part.
You're absolutely correct. This pandemic has also been labeled infodemic, because this is the first time we are in the midst of a crisis when news spreads faster than possibly the virus is. And a lot of the information, unfortunately, that is getting out might or might not be accurate, creating more anxiety, creating more angst amongst people. And whilst we are all separated, we trying to stay connected and deal with the emergency. So this is different times. Hopefully we won't have to deal with it again for possibly another 100 years, but our world does continue to change. Any new initiatives that you are thinking of, any new expectations from guest point of view or owner's point of view while you're in the midst of this pandemic or preparing for recovery?
I think in terms of new initiatives, we're certainly having discussions about them, and we're doing things in different ways, as a little bit as we've described already. A lot more online activity, communicating the way we are. There are businesses that have been created from this. I mean, hotels weren't previously involved in the food takeout business. But we have engaged in that. Most of or all of the malls in the city here in Bangkok are closed, except for some food establishments, and they can only do takeout. So we have joined forces with them. So that's an avenue that we may continue. We may expand in some way. We may put up a central kitchen somewhere so that we can really compete in a more viable way with other businesses that are entirely focused on takeout. I'm sitting on the 51st floor of our hotel here. We have a rooftop. Obviously, the experience that a customer is going to have there is not only the food; it's everything else about that experience. So hopefully that will come back soon. But in the interim. Obviously, hygiene and sanitation will be a key focus. Maybe more distancing in places like fitness centers. Capacities of function rooms will be perhaps reduced, just to give people that are when they do start traveling again some comfort that there has been a learning from this situation, and certain things will happen differently.
For instance, in the restaurants, are you looking at possibly rearranging seating arrangements, and how about the buffet restaurants, which are quite popular in Asia? Are you looking at that, serving food in a very different way, so there's no lines by the buffets any longer when we're going into the normal daily life?
Very much so. I mean, as we see it, looking at the recovery, it'll happen in stages. It would be great to think that it might even come back as quickly as it did in SARS, and it came back quickly in SARS because there weren't any real travel restrictions placed, or very minor travel restrictions only in a few places. In this case, it's gone much more widespread than that. So. Definitely, in the first phase, I would see no buffets. I would see, people being concerned to find certain situations that are still very much focused on optimizing hygiene, sanitation, distancing between people. A lot of it will depend on when a vaccine is introduced. I think most. Are saying that that's not likely to happen much before the end of the year or the beginning of next year. But in phase one, very much, no buffets, more distance between tables. Phase two, certain elements may start coming back. And then when we get into the full return, I think that full return will have a certain differences in appearance than it had before this all started, and in some respects that's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's our governor of California, when he was talking about what the recovery might look like and transitioning into what the new norm is. He was warning people that you might be in a restaurant sitting where the wait staff is wearing a mask. I hope that the masks don't become part of our regular uniform anymore, but white glove service that was in place years ago, the gloves might be brought back in as we recover. It is different world, and we need to be prepared for that as we start to welcome the guests back in.
Maybe if I may, Abid, I mean, clearly wearing masks is maybe more usual in Asia than other parts of the world for different reasons. We did have our staff wearing masks at the reception desk in the restaurants, as guided by the local health authority, and we've always followed whatever the local health authority has advised. I think as long as there's no vaccine, even patrons would expect to see that, but not in the long term. I mean, it just doesn't. That's not what you go to a restaurant for, to see people hiding behind masks. So hopefully, once we have the vaccine, once people are comfortable going out again, fully comfortable, then the masks will come off and the real experiences will return with a different kind of value or appreciation of everything that we have, that we've been deprived of for a period of time.
I'm interested about the operation. I mean, eventually, I was listening to some discussions where they are talking about the mom and pop sentiment, meaning that kind of mom and pop stores where both of them are doing different things, so multitasking. How do you see that advancing in your hotels, considering that now we have this situation, and maybe you already had multitasking, but are you going to take it to a step further because of what has happened now?
Yeah, no, I don't really see a change where that's concerned. We do, in effect, have multitasking already in place. It's a natural way of organizing because you're not at peak hour everywhere at the same time. So I think there will be small nuances that will be part of the new norm, but it will be more along, and in addition to that, it'll be more along, creating even better experiences, compensating more generosity, different things that will create an even better experience for patrons of restaurants when they start going back to them.
Markland, alternative accommodations, we have dealt with it as different platforms have emerged in the last decade. How do you think that sector will change?
Well, it's interesting. During SARS, at the time, I owned a bed and breakfast in Vancouver, 8 suites, and I was managing a facility that had 2,080 rooms. Both were impacted similarly. So, this is a tourism-wide phenomenon, a hospitality-wide phenomenon. So, certainly that kind of accommodation has been impacted also. I would say, there's been quite an active debate about alternative accommodation not requiring the same levels of regulations, permitting, that type of thing as hotels require. And maybe in the short term, that will result in people, when they're traveling, being more focused on staying in hotels because they know they're more highly regulated and the hygiene and sanitation will be there. In the longer term, my hope is that alternative accommodation will also prosper, just like low-cost air carriers. All of those things promote for people to travel. They make it easier for a greater number of people to travel, and hopefully that will not be that enthusiasm will not be diluted in the long term. On the contrary, there will continue to be innovations and competition that will result in even more people traveling and seeing the world.
Last question before we move on, and thank you. That has been great insight. Any new technologies, any new disruptors you see coming out as a result of this pandemic and the experiences that the industry is gaining?
I think what we're anticipating is the level of online purchase will only increase. Where hotels, where airlines are concerned, generally you enjoy better rates when you prepay, but when you prepay, you have less flexibility. I think maybe prepayment will go away, and people will get other benefits depending on when they book. But the key element, I think, is a stronger focus towards online, stronger focus towards digital solutions. Maybe the incidence of people booking through intermediaries will lessen in order to have direct relationships that you can rely on that will help you out if you have a problem and need to make changes. But the other thing is where meetings are concerned. Here we are all having a meeting that 10 years ago we would have gotten on planes. All of you would have gotten on the planes and come to visit me in Bangkok. That will happen less. It'll still happen, but there'll be a lot more virtual meetings happening and using technology. Technology will have a stronger hold and will disrupt further, I'm sure. But that's not all a bad thing. I think things evolve, and it's our business. It should be our business to evolve as the industry evolves, the world evolves.
Well, thank you, Markland. Great insight. Thank you very much. Moving on to our next guest, Govinda Singh, who is with Colliers International. Hi, Govinda.
Hi. Good evening.
How are things in Singapore? It's getting pretty late for you.
It is. I'm just sitting outside on the balcony watching the sun go down. As you can see, there's still some sunlight out here. But hopefully, as they say, the sun goes down, it rises the next day, right? And I hope that's the same for the hotel industry. We certainly are going through some tough times, but I'm sure we'll be back.
Absolutely. Our guest, the last time Sam and I were together, and I really enjoyed what Dr. Tucker had said. She said, tough times don't last, tough people do. So industry is very resilient, and I think we will get through it. So starting out, Govinda, if you could tell us the general sentiment. I know in Asia Pacific, reading one of the McKinsey reports, the sentiment is pretty positive. They're pretty positive that the economy would come back. There is a lot of uncertainty, but the sentiment is relatively positive from consumer point of view. What is the industry thinking about? What is their feeling?
As you said, I think that the sentiment is generally positive. I think the issue here is all about timing, and I don't think it's an Asia-specific problem because everyone is saying, does it last 3 months? Does it last 5 months? Is it next year? No one knows at the moment because the time horizon keeps slipping. And for me, I always say, China is kind of coming out of it, but the concern here is about the second wave. I think a lot of the countries now have gone through the first wave, especially now, this all started October, November, depends who you want to believe in China. And then it's ended up in Europe in February, March, and then 1 month after that, it was the US. Looking at the gestation period, it's about 3-4 months for the first wave to last. So even if you look at the US as being hit the last, you're talking June, July before the first wave can be manageable. So the concern here is long term. I don't think there's an issue. Everyone knows, whether it's for business, whether it's for vacation, travel is become part of our DNA. I remember you guys probably a bit older than me, but I remember young days, traveling on holidays was a luxury. Now it's become, part of, we have to, it's a must. And with Asia here, you still have, unlike the West, arguably, where it's a bit more mature, Asia is still rapidly growing. There's still that huge middle class growing, getting wealthy. They want more experiences. They're not going to stay at home forever. So hence, I think here there's still much more growth opportunity, and hence why a lot of people are positive. The other issue is a lot of hotels and owners, when it comes to leverage, for example, and borrowings on assets, it's not as high as sometimes with the West, where it can go 70, 80, 90% in some cases. Here, you're lucky you get 60, 65%. So I think there's a bit more of headroom. And the type of owners also you have here is less private equity, which has that 5-7 year cycle. So a lot of them are just willing to say, you know what, we're happy to just hold on and watch the world go by.
Well, terrific. Asia Pacific is similar but different in many ways. Apart from the business sector in large hubs, the likes of Singapore, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Jakarta, Tokyo, Asia also commands a massive segment of leisure travel. In addition to the domestic traveler, they also have a huge influx of international visitors coming into the markets. Any thoughts on how that might be impacted?
The great news about Asia or Asia Pac, including Australia, New Zealand, etc. Around 65% of it is intra-region. So we don't depend as much on the West, shall we say, from Europe and the US for local visitation. So there's part of that's really great news for hotels and tourism here in Asia, because hopefully they'll be opening, flights going to get back up in the air a bit sooner, shall we say, which will start encouraging a bit more travel sooner than our counterparts in the West. So there's a bit of hope on that. However, having said that, again, it goes back to, how do you control the second wave that's inevitably going to come, especially for us? Do you then say, you adapt a Japanese version or a Korean version to say, no flights from the West, we're just going to keep it within Asia, and then run with that, and also try to push the staycation experience? Because, a lot of hoteliers now, initially before the lockdown became a bit more, or a bit tighter, I should say, we're looking at the staycation market, and that became a good filler, if anything else.
Certainly, staycation has been around, and I think as we recover from this pandemic, that probably is the first segment that will come back after being cooped up for however many weeks that the people are staying inside. I think that would come back very quickly. Any from a wider perspective, any initiatives, any incentives that different governments might have extended to the industry?
Different governments have different responses, and if you look around, I think Singapore was held as one of the best, but unfortunately, it's going through a bit of a tough time right now with the work of Durhams. But if you look at how Taiwan and Vietnam, of all countries, have handled it, it's been really commendable, and those are really good models to look at in terms of how other countries should be handling this. Going forward, again, it all comes down to what this has done. I mean, Asia has had its pick, shall we say, of events. Back in 2000, and you had you had swine flu, you had MERS, you had SARS. Now you have COVID-19. So that those previous events, I think, has put Asia at the front foot, shall we say, of dealing with these kinds of crises. And as Markland alluded to earlier, they've been able to bounce back quite quickly. Unfortunately, I think we're on uncharted territory here, because I think there's two issues. Number one, the health issue, and COVID is quite highly infectious, more than the MERS and the SARS, etc. It's like the influenza, right? It just goes everywhere. So it's very difficult to control. Even with a vaccine, I would argue I don't think this is here probably to stay over the medium to long term, and we have to. Might be the new norm. The second issue is the impact it's had on the economy. I think if you look at the data, even 2000, especially for Asia, the 2009, the GFC, 2008-9 GFC didn't hit Asia as bad as it hit the West. Now Asia is getting that massive double whammy, as it were.
Okay. I know you have a wider view of the industry. A lot of the hotels, as Markland talked about, and we all know, a lot of the hotels are either shut down or operating at minimum capacity. There's virtually no travel. What are some of the things that hotels are doing to manage the cash flow and look after the payroll side of it, looking after associates, but at the same time, the business model?
I think a lot of hotels, they're over here, it's either they're closed or at the moment, or they're accommodating people in quarantine. Fortunately, I think even the luxury hotels, the richer folks have putting their kids into quarantine at the luxury hotels, which is quite nice for some. So there's always demand somewhere, so we say. And for the lower ones, for foreign workers especially who cannot get home to their countries, I think a lot of the budget and economy hotels are picking some of that business up. But obviously, that's still highly regulated. And a lot, as I said earlier, different governments respond to this differently. I've seen, I think in Denmark and Norway, in Singapore, in the UK, where they're picking up around 75 to 80% of the wages. I think that's really good. And they've just forlonged the staff until things have come back. So at least that's some kind of benefit. I mean, it means that your staff has a bit of breathing space, because as we all know, once you lose your staff, it's more expensive to hire someone back in later on. So that's one good thing. What this actually, which one thing that could change here, and you mentioned the point of cash flows, and cash is king. And maybe I was thinking when we had our previous conversation on this, maybe this is an opportunity for something what I would call, EBITDA or working capital insurance. If there's anyone in the insurance business on the call, because if these so-called black swan events are meant to, with climate change, etc., are meant to occur a bit more often, why not? Because as we all know, hotels are dynamic cash flows. They change every night. And, if one of these things happen, you want to protect your business, banks want a bit more comfort in terms of lending, then why not have some insurance on that? And it's quite curious. We have business interruption insurance, etc. Why not have a bit of, working capital, and it can be, 18 months, whatever it takes. And it doesn't have to be for black swan events. It can be for, global financial crisis. So it'll be interesting to see how these things come out. And, in every crisis, as someone said, there's always opportunity. So I'm sure some smart person is going to come up with something to mitigate this going forward.
Govinda, I have written that down, so after we get off air, I'll be calling you.
I'll take my cut, please.
Yes, there you go. If nothing else, at least the people on this call will start our own thing, because we understand the industry. A couple of last things. How do you think that the capital markets for the industry will change?
Well, as I said earlier in the call, I think the business model and the investment model for hotels in Asia is quite different from many parts of the western part of the world, where leverage is quite low, and people tend to view assets here as more medium to long-term investments. Hence, you find the transaction market very slow here as well. So, our cap rate report came out earlier today, and we're seeing in most markets, offices and hotels, and industrial, I think for obvious reasons, are pretty much, especially industrial, are pretty much stable in terms of where yields are. So everyone is taking, let's wait and see approach. I guess they're thinking, if not a V-shaped recovery, it's at least a Nike swoosh that's going to happen. And it's as I said earlier, everyone out there knows. People have to travel, business return. It's just a timing issue. And if banks are accommodating, and certainly in the West, as I said, a lot of people have enough cash flow, they can sit and wait it out. Of course, there's going to be a few fallout. And this is when your operator and your relationship, your bank become even more important.
I think those relationships are going to be tested in the coming months, because granted that in Asia Pacific, particularly Asia, the assets aren't badly levered, but nonetheless there is debt on the assets. But those relationships are going to be tested, whether it is owner-operator or lender and owner. I think all that will come into play. Hang tight there, Govinda. Thank you so much for your insight. I'm going to bring on Rahul next. Rahul is head of hospitality and leisure, based out of Sydney with Squire Patton Boggs. Rahul, how are things with you? And it is very late for you, so thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Abid, and thank you for having me as well, Sam-Erik. It's great to participate with Govinda and Markland. I think this is an important time, and communication, as Markland was saying earlier, is key. And how we work through this and we come out the other end is key. So I appreciate the opportunity to join you.
So, Rahul, I have lots of friends in legal profession, but typically all of us try to stay away from the lawyers. Now,
Yes.
You certainly get involved in all different fronts, whether it's labor law side of things, or it is the contractual law issues, or it might be the debt covenants that might come into play. Tell us, what types of things is the industry looking at today?
Sure. Look, absolutely. And like you, I try to stay away from lawyers as well. Deal with very often. We are dealing with everything you've mentioned and more. I think the first thing probably to note is the immediacy of these events and the effect it has had on the industry, number one. And number two is the flow-on effect, how it is the domino effect from one thing to another, whether it is your supply, your linen service, your cafe downstairs or around the corner, the transport intersection with the hotel, tourism destinations, and business travel, and how immediately and how harshly it has been affected. What this has led to is, I guess at a first stage, is response and mitigation, damage control, communication, trying to understand what the state of play is and how it's evolving, trying to guess what the future might be. And that's probably the first step. The second step is necessarily looking at the legal world around you and what I frame the legal architecture. And that is the labor laws. What do they say right now? Or what are the arrangements for hotel employees or tourist asset employees and staff, and both their transport mechanisms to get to the hotel or destination, and how are they able to then provide services, and what are those services they're providing? What do the laws say? What are the other regulations that apply to those staff, whether it's enterprise agreements or other types of policies? And how does the government intersect with that? What rules are being passed at a different legislative or jurisdictional basis? That's probably number one. Number two is, what are the service arrangements that are in place and how are those impacted? Again, we're looking at what do the documents say, but also what is the common law that applies, and what are the relevant jurisdictions that apply, particularly in cross-border relationships where you might have operations offshore or sales and marketing services provided in different jurisdictions. And then what are the different supply chains that are being relied upon, and what do the changes do to those supply chains? So it's a real mix of things, from business, from damage control, from and I would say there are a few positive things to see, and one of them is the way people are working together to find solutions. You mentioned earlier in terms of bank lending, the bank's approach right now will have a big impact. The government regulations will have a big impact, and the relationship between owners and operators will have a big impact. What I have seen is the desire to keep staff employed and to find ways to keep that business ready and able to kickstart, restart, reboot when the environment is safe and the regulations are in place to do so. And I think that's critical for our industry. I think we have all been working in our different areas of expertise at building the industry, but also building the desire for people to be part of the industry, and seeing that this is not an industry that is a high risk environment, but one that yes, it has ebbs and flows, and yes, there are changes to circumstances, but is one that holds together and supports staff and supports the business to then continue is quite important. And I've been quite heartened to see the steps that everyone has been taking. I think with that does flow on is that there is the reality, the punch in the gut, so to speak, where businesses are struggling to stay afloat and struggling to manage cash flows. There isn't the golden ticket yet, Govinda, of the insurance on EBITDA, but maybe that will come. But so it is trying to make every dollar do $10 worth of work, or one dong doing 10 dong worth of work, or whatever currency you're in, making it stretch. So that's the environment we're playing in, and in those environments, relationships do get tested. And we're probably in a cycle right now of mitigation, damage control, and planning to keep our heads above water. And we will be probably facing more challenges ahead, both in terms of staffing as well as relationships and contractual arrangements.
Thank you. Rahul, one of the things that have come up, possibly not so much for the hotels as much as I have heard in the restaurant sector, the business interruption policies for insurance sometimes do not cover pandemics. As a matter of fact, I recently heard an incident where even though it was explicitly stated in the insurance policy, it was not covered. We earlier talked about some of the folks quarantining themselves in the hotels as opposed to homes. Whilst that might sound really good, that presents other challenges. And yesterday I was involved in a legal panel discussion where they were talking about what implications that could possibly have with staff that are working in the hotel and looking after people that are not feeling 100%, because certainly hoteliers tend to know a lot, but healthcare is not something that we want to get involved in. Any thoughts on insurance policies, liability things that are coming down the pike, and hotels that are being used for quarantining purposes?
Sure. I mean, look, I think that's a very important question, and probably there isn't a black and white answer at this stage. Insurance policies will, often have exclusions on pandemic or not include them. What I think is important at this stage is the devil in the detail. And perhaps I just take a sidestep for a second, is to look at force majeure events, which has probably been a topic of discussion amongst many hotel owners and operators on what happens where circumstances outside of everyone's control happen, and how is that described in the relevant agreements, and what are the flow-on effect of those agreements. The reason I use that as an example is it goes to the details of force majeure as a defined term, number one. And number two is, are we seeing one event, or are we seeing a series of events? Perhaps a government closure, or mandated stand-down provisions for employees, or closing of an airport. Each of those events may have triggers. And so I use that as an example to come back to insurance to say, what does the insurance policy say, and what are the events we're talking about? Because speaking of the COVID-19 as a event, a pandemic, makes sense to me. But when looking at the details of the insurance policy, it may be that there are other events that have affected the business that may give rise to appropriate communication between the insurer and the insured party, and appropriate steps to be taken. One thing probably also to remember are general responsibilities and mitigation, and those will be impacted by different laws in different jurisdictions. But what steps is everyone taking to manage and to communicate? So I think insurance is, we're at the early stages of assessing what it means and what claims, if any, are available. But I think it will be, again, very specific on the terms of the insurance and how the different circumstances in a particular place evolve.
So before I hand it to Sam for questioning, one other thing, our legal documents in the industry typically tend to be very thick theses. As a result of this pandemic, do we anticipate that they're going to go from what it is today to even thicker documents?
Well, look, I think they will definitely need to deal with the learnings from the present circumstances in a more sophisticated way. Whether that adds more pages, I certainly hope not. I think most documents have too many pages. But that's often because we say the same thing 10 different ways 10 different times. And so I think it is also our lawyers' responsibility to cut back the extra pages and focus on those things that are relevant and learning from things that are happening now, and perhaps taking a bit more time to think about ways or potential issues that may come down the path. So I think we will look at more sophisticated arrangements with dealing with force majeure, flow-on effects, and how to address them, responsibilities on parties to mitigate, but also probably a more sophisticated communication protocol when these things happen. And I think where I'm seeing positive response is where there's a good communication between an owner and operator. And where there are more challenges is where people don't feel they know what's happening. And it may be on either side of the fence. So I do think we will need to take a more sophisticated approach. I think we'll need to think about things a bit more in the future. To my mind, and I would say this across hotel management agreements, but as well as hotel transactional related documents and other types of agreements, they haven't really evolved to the last 40, 50 years from what I've seen. And I do feel that this is a bit of a kick to say we need to be thinking ahead, and we need to be thinking clearer. We don't need longer documents, we need clearer documents.
Terrific. Sam?
Well, I'm interested in just your views on the type of business models or agreements that are in this situation has fared best. Or what is your experience, or what have you seen now in the market? Whether it's a lease agreement or management agreement or franchises, whatnot. Yeah,
look, I would say, I guess the first and obvious answer is everybody is being hit. And where, I guess the first point I'd make is the different structures of those agreements between lease, management agreement, and owner-operator models, just as wide examples, are who owns the business and who's running the business, and what are the arrangements in terms of risk, liability, and fee terms under those arrangements. I would say probably the management contracts are probably the most evolved, at least in this part of the world, that is in Asia Pacific. And under those, it's a shared pain between owners and operators. But at the end of the day, the operator is there acting as best they can as the agent for the owner. And so they will be hurt, and the owner will be hurt. The owner will also be bearing the capital risk or capital loss on the value of the asset. And that's probably where there's an additional bit of pain. Abid, you mentioned earlier in terms of tenancies and use of property. I hope that's not something we see adversely impacting hotels, but I do think it will be something we'll see a bit in commercial real estate, and where there are mixed-use projects involving commercial and hotel and retail, we might see some changes there. In terms of leases, it is something that tenants are really feeling. Probably one of the big things is under leases, I would say traditionally you don't see force majeure type arrangements. And so the tenant there has to pay rent. Now, if that rent is on a part turnover basis, that might share some of the pain with the landowner. But generally, a hotel operator who is operating under a tenancy and therefore is a business owner will be feeling probably the pain, I think, the hardest in that space. Owner operators are probably feeling all the pain on both the operations and the ownership, and I think it's very hard. And it's how to manage. One of the things I think, Abid, you mentioned earlier was quarantine arrangements and some government mandated restrictions or regulations that apply. And what we've seen, at least in the Australian jurisdictions, is different approaches taken by government will have different impact on lease products, managed products, and owner-operator product.
Thank you. And Abid?
So just a thought, the industry has enjoyed a very buoyant time period for the last, 5, 6, 7 years or so. I remember participating in one of the industry conferences in Australia, and the transaction volume all around the world has been very healthy. Any thoughts as to how that is going to change? I certainly gathered that some of the hotels might not be able to service their debts, but apart from that, do you think it will go up? It'll stay about the same and normalize? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Look, I think that's a very good question, and I'm concerned in the short term. I suspect that we will see we have already seen a significant slowdown in transactions, and I expect that to stay for a period of time. I'm hoping that is a short period of time, and the rebound will be led by a couple of different things, probably distressed asset transactions. And the key on that will be on the buy side to be very efficient in transactions. Probably in Australia, we've seen a slowdown on the time by which it takes to start due diligence and to close a deal. And I think that period is now taking too long, frankly, and will be compressed, which will be a positive sign. Distressed transactions are never a happy time, but there are opportunities and probably repositioning of assets, which does lead to new opportunities, and perhaps new brands or brands evolving as well from an operational perspective. So I suspect in the medium term we'll see first an increase on some transactions. So from a very low base in the short term, and to the medium term increase on distressed transactions, and probably some group transactions that are also looking to raise capital. And they might have some key assets that people have been waiting to buy, but they have plans to redeploy that for new transactions or new opportunities. We might also see, I think we saw maybe a slight pause on development, but development that has an opening over the 18-month period, I feel that's still relatively healthy, although there will be some concern. And we might see that pick up a bit as there is renewed confidence, so that new openings are staged over a period of time, perhaps over the 18 to 24-month period. But that might also kind of give some energy back. Obviously, there will be new jobs created, and probably transaction volumes increasing that way. So probably that medium to longer term, I'm hopeful. The short term, I think we'll have to wait and see, but I hope that short term is very short.
Thank you. Last question before we bring the panel back on for some questions. I've had a couple of questions that have been directly sent to me, but anything that we can do to prepare for the reboot, particularly from legal lens point of view, or generally, what can the industry do to prepare for the restart?
Sure.
Well, that was for you. I beg your pardon.
Okay, apologies. Look, reboot is paramount. I think what I've been pleased to see is I think people's minds are already turning to reboot, and how we do it, to my mind, will be driven by probably three big parts. One is regulations and the support that governments are able to provide in terms of supporting businesses to reopen through both regulations and whether it's abatements on rates and taxes, or whether it's support through financial funding. Number one. Number two, I think, is looking at the opportunities perhaps we as a group have sat in our hands on and putting some money into that. That might be tourism-related infrastructure. And that may be hospitality infrastructure, it may be transport infrastructure, but that intersection, which we've seen really impacted as a result of the virus and the spread of the virus. So I'd expect tourism infrastructure to be part of that reboot. And finally is communication and getting back together. I mean, we're all looking forward to being outside and engaging together, and that's part of business travel and tourism. So the sooner we're able to do that and re-engage with places, with environments, whether it's enjoying the sands of the beaches down the south coast of Sidney, or the beautiful cityscape we have here, or traveling through Vietnam, the beautiful history and the modernity, it's getting out there, which will be a big part of that reboot.
Terrific. Well, thank you again, Sam. Let's bring the panel back. You guys are absolutely correct. Even at the worst time in financial crisis, I think that the tourism sector grew double digits. Unfortunately, in this pandemic, we are fighting an enemy that cannot be seen, but it's a matter of time that we will overcome it. The industry is very, very resilient. One of the questions that have come up, and I'll throw it out to the panel, maybe starting with Govinda. The question was, will we expect more M&A activities in the hospitality sector? If so, will it result from concentration of ownership, or do you see divestiture happening, both in respect to the property owners and operators? Govinda, any thoughts on that, starting out with you or anybody else?
Sure. I think, and Rahul alluded to this earlier, I think we have to separate it into two bits. One is going to be the distressed side of the business, and the other one is going to be the good assets, shall we say. And there's always, in these times of crisis, especially, I would expect in places like Australia, etc., there might be some distressed assets that's going to come on the market. And people are always going to be looking at opportunities. The question it goes back to whether the banks are willing to finance them. So, as we all know, banks, especially, which always bemuses me, because I would thought banks would want to be lending for development or financing in downtimes to prepare for the upside, right? Because they'll have a great runway. The second side is, from what we're seeing in the transaction market, no one is willing to give discounts. Even when Hong Kong, I give you Hong Kong as a good example, because they had a crisis before COVID-19. We haven't seen asset values move very much. People are just willing to say, you know what, we're happy. We know this is going to pass. We know the fundamentals over the medium to long term are there. Why should we sell at a discount now? Unless they're severely pushed for cash flow. If they have enough, working capital or cash flow there, I think most people are going to be willing to sit it out. What I think is going to happen is more M&A, and I kind of like what. It's interesting because we change from asset heavy, shall we say, to asset light. I think this was in the 2000s, if I can remember correctly. And one of the curious things that especially groups like Accor has been doing is moving back into investing in assets. And I think in times like these, having assets to securitize against cash flows is very important. And I won't be surprised. A lot of the more HMA, the management companies, the pure management companies will start looking back at investing in assets so that they can collateralize that cash flow going forward, to especially deal with these kind of pandemics or crisis. So I think, going back to your original question, in the short term, I expect some fallout from distressed assets, but medium and long term, it's the continued trend of M&A, or people just gonna continue to wait till the market is settled and there's some sense of normalcy. And when we look at transactions right now, almost immediately the starting point from both buyer and seller is, we know this is a one-off, let's discount this. What is the trailing cash flow? What's the trailing yield in a normalized situation? What's theoretically the value?
I think that's where Asia is very different, because a lot of the assets are not necessarily owned by institutional money, and that private family offices, and they tend to be longer hold organizations. And Asia definitely will work through that. It's certainly in U.S. over the last couple of years, there have been few real estate investment trusts that have merged to make bigger organizations. And obviously, we've all heard about the brands and the operators coming together. Rahul, if I may ask you your thoughts on M&A activities, whether it's on operator side or ownership side, or do you see it'll go up or stay about the same?
Look, I think perhaps picking up Govinda's point there, diversified portfolios are going to be key. That's managing the risk in different ways. So while operators have traditionally, probably in the last 10, 15 years moved away from being asset heavy to be very asset light, there might be a shift in that way, back to having perhaps some greater capital assets in their portfolio. Number one, I kind of feel that we might see a little bit of slowdown in the M&A activity between brands, as brands first take the opportunity to perhaps regroup, look at other forms of efficiencies, look at other forms of technology to bring in, and maybe looking at targeting or joining with other brands that have a strong technology-based platform. as opposed to simply a strong brand presence. So there might be a bit of a shift in the type of M&A activity, but the M&A activity generally I expect to pick back up and to be quite healthy across the board. I think we were just seeing more and more confidence in hospitality type assets and in the M&A space as more sophisticated product. Probably to another comment that Govinda made, my one concern overall is the understanding and the sophisticated view that banks take in looking at hospitality product, and I guess making sure and finding ways to ensure that they remain confident and seeing also and appreciating also the resilience of the industry in rebounding from this and rebounding strongly, because that will have a significant impact on the transaction volume and access to debt.
Thank you. Markland, if you have any thoughts on this, or also how can the industry gain consumer confidence? Because certainly, sanitized rooms and sanitized facilities is going to become a big issue. People wearing masks or gloves, at least in the short term, but even in the longer term, as some of the travel comes back. Any particular thoughts on how we can gain the consumer confidence back?
Sure. Maybe before I get to that question, I'll talk a little bit about the earlier question, and just from the point of view of a company like ours, which is focused on owning and managing. We had a plan of growing. We have actually an aggressive plan to grow over the next 5 years by 2.5 times. We see now an opportunity. Obviously, we need to be focused on keeping our house in order through difficult times, but we also see an opportunity to accelerate those plans. And clearly, if I forget if it was Govinda or Rahul who mentioned that the recovery may be of the order of a swoosh, as in over a longer period of time, the only way you can really see some growth in your revenues and your bottom line will be if you're able to grow. In terms of offering reassurance, I think this goes beyond hotels. It's into every aspect of life. As we mentioned earlier, having a vaccine will be a breakthrough, and then it'll just be another form of flu. Then I think we need to be prepared for the next variety and learn from today's situation so that we can put things in place more quickly. We can reduce the loss of life by virtue of doing that. And then hopefully with technology and medicine, we'll be able to find the new vaccines more quickly. And these won't be as disruptive as this particular case has been. Definitely, you don't go on a vacation to the beach to see people looking like they're clearing out from a biological disaster. Those two don't go together, right? So people will start traveling when that's under control, and when they live the experiences they used to live, that they look forward to living, and even something better than that. Added value, new experiences, things that will make it even more interesting to travel.
It's travel has after 9/11 era, the security lines at the airport became a miserable experience. You had to add additional time to get to the airport so that you can at least make your flight. I understand at least a couple of the airports that are starting to slowly open, the likes of Dubai and Hong Kong, they are doing testing before you're allowed to go in. I hope that's a short-term measure and possibly a wise thing to do today. But I wonder if those types of things, or at the airport, you walking through not only a metal detector, but a temperature scanner will become a norm in our travel lives. But it is interesting.
I have a question for Markland.
Sure.
Looking in future, since you are planning of growing, you have a plan to grow the company and new projects coming online. Any views on, will there be any changes or developments in terms of technical services or the specs of hotels that maybe the lesson that has been learned from this corona situation, where you need to address M&E in a different way, or there might something that might be something that pops up in the people's mind, that they want to have more sense of security about the airflow and whatnot. So any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think relative to COVID-19 in particular, it's a bit early to say. But in terms of developing with a higher purpose than just providing another resort or another city hotel, I think that's a trend that's happening in the business, and doing things in a more sustainable way in terms of choice of materials, building into new developments systems that are going to be more eco-friendly. Solar panels. I mean, I'm in a part of the world that is blessed with lots of sun. So things like that are already happening. Specifically in relation to COVID, I guess it would relate to issues of hygiene and sanitation, and maybe there will be over time the development of techniques that will be able to do the work more expeditiously, more efficiently than is the case today. But too early to say, I think, in a bigger way than that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are approaching the end of our session, so I will come around to each of you, all three of you. Again, thank you for your insight. It has been terrific. I personally have learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers would learn a lot. A couple of things. As we all know, during this time period, we've been hearing all about suffering and pain. But there is a lot of great work that different organizations are doing. There is a lot of good work that the industry is putting forth. If I may ask each of you to share that. And one thing on a personal note, while we have been in this isolation phase, anything unique that you've learned about yourself? So let me start out with Rahul, if I may.
A tricky question for me first. Thank you, Abid. Look, probably on the first part, one of the things that I was really, I guess, pleased to see and be seeing is the response and the collaboration between staff at hotels, the hotel owners, the operators, and finding ways to persevere, whether it's in a very limited capacity or through other arrangements. We have here hotels that have come to arrangements where they are providing rooms for quarantine returning travelers. And seeing the response of staff who want to be involved and support in a healthy manner, seeing the response from guests, particularly over the Easter break, and still being able to receive some chocolates with the necessary health precautions. I think that's really kind of lifted my spirits a bit, because it is very challenging seeing everyone going through a very difficult period. Personally, I guess this lockdown arrangement, however regulated or implemented, reinforces our humanity and need to connect with people, to be face to face, to shake hands, to give hugs, and the importance of that. And number one, and number two is, and I must say I haven't done enough, but I'd like to be more involved. I'm sure we all would. There is always someone or many people who have it a lot more worse than us right now. Is how do we engage and support people much more disadvantaged, perhaps feeling the sharpness of the current circumstances 100 times worse, and being able to activate, notwithstanding we might be locked in a room or a house or a backyard, and being able to support those around us. And so looking internally and finding ways to do that.
Thank you, Rahul. Markland, may I ask you to go next?
Sure. No, I'm happy to. I mean, there are in this situation there are some real heroes, the medical workers in the hotel context, the staff that are on the front line. So we've done a few things to those constituents. We've offered rooms actually in this hotel for some medical workers. We've taken precautions so that other guests of the hotel are not impacted and have no loss of peace of mind. But we really felt that we need to do something for those heroes. We've got a hotel in Oman that is offering up to 120 rooms for people coming back. Do that. Our owner there has done it entirely on a philanthropic basis, and again, just take certain precautions to make sure that others are not impacted by it. So, serving meals, sending meals down to the hospitals, providing a little bit of relief that way. I don't think we can do too much. On a personal level, I mean, of course, when you're in your work, you're doing. You do things a certain way, and you lose sight of some of the things that Rahul mentioned. Giving somebody a hug, being at home. You have more time to focus on things, reading, taking a course, even cooking, which is something I never do. Unfortunately, it hasn't improved much, but I've enjoyed doing it. And we've managed to sustain ourselves. So, making the most of a negative situation.
Thank you, Markland. And last but certainly not least, Govinda.
Oh no, I'll just echo previous thoughts. I think it's amazing to see how much the community and obviously the health services, etc., have come together and really driving this forward. But it's also, for our industry, it's put us on the map, because if there's anything, it's highlighted, how important tourism and travel is to every country in the world. And differ across different sectors. It's whether it's the airline, whether it's healthcare, whatever. People can't get anywhere. People can't stay anywhere. There is a material impact. And in my time, tourism has always been on the back bench, as it were. But I think certainly this has highlighted the importance of it, and hopefully, it's going to form an inertia to get governments to back it even a bit more. And also to become part and parcel of the community, whether it's through sustainability or through enhancing employment and community work. On a personal note, it's been great to spend time with the kids. Working from home with a 2-year-old. Breaking out the doors.
Say no more.
Well, thank you, guys.
Thank you. Sam, anything from you before we do the closing comments?
Well, I have to also share what I learned from this. I think we are we are the ultimate mobile device. We make phone calls, we make video calls, and I have had a chance also to enjoy the best home-cooked food possible, which I'm very grateful for my wife, who's been really looking after it. And I also do some cooking, but I have not comparable to what she does. So, but I also have tried to do a little bit of developing some online courses of sharing some experiences, and I'm learning how to go about it. So those are the few things from my side. How about you, Abid?
Well, I'll share a good story first that I heard in the news. As a matter of fact, this was in New Jersey. The tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut are sort of the ground zero for U.S. pandemic that is going on. And this gentleman who typically delivered newspapers for the neighborhood, he recognized that some of the folks that he was delivering newspaper to, they were elderly and they could not even come out to the end of their driveway to pick up the newspaper. Knowing that, he voluntarily put in a note one day to say, look, if you need any groceries picked up, please let me know. I'll be more than glad to deliver the groceries. And all of a sudden, his phone started ringing off the hook. And while he was at home, after delivering the newspaper, he would go out and pick up the groceries for these elderly folks and deliver it. So I thought that was very, very touching that somebody took it upon themselves to help out a community that is possibly most vulnerable with this pandemic. Relative to my personal things, I guess I'm trying to learn how to be more patient. I don't know if I've gotten any better at it or not, but it's a work in progress. Obviously, things move slowly, but trying to find updates and trying to sift through the misinformation that is being circulated has been a challenge. And as frustrating as it can be, you really do learn a lot about yourself as to how you can deal with it. So on that note, my thanks to Markland, thanks to Govinda and Rahul. It was a great panel, great insight. We really appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure we'll have you on again soon to discuss as we come out of this pandemic, because collectively we can learn a lot. On behalf of Hospitality Talks, thank you for taking the time to participate in this panel. Sam.
Well, thanks very much again, everyone. It's been a great pleasure and honor to have you today in our Hospitality Talks. And during this process, I also learned a lot. And now also like special thanks also to the live viewers who stayed with us on YouTube and on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, please join our Hospitality Talks group. There we're sharing information, and it's a forum for discussion. And for the YouTube viewers, please subscribe and press that notification bell, and make sure you join our next episode. So thanks again, and be safe and stay well.
Thank you.